The cabin sat like a forgotten gravestone against the Colorado Rockies, its windows dark and shuttered since Grandpa Ernie's funeral 3 months ago. Elisa pulled her jacket tight over her growing belly as she climbed the creaking porch steps, keys trembling in her frozen fingers. She'd come here to clean out his belongings, to say goodbye to the man who'd raised her after her parents died. What she didn't expect was Calix going absolutely wild the moment they stepped inside. Her German shepherd clawed frantically at the basement floorboards, whining with an intensity that made Elisa's skin crawl. When the loose board finally gave way, revealing a hidden compartment, her breath caught. Stacks of cash, false passports with Ernie's face but different names, and photographs of people she'd never seen before, people who looked terrified. Suddenly, every story Ernie had told her about his simple life crumbled. Who was her grandfather really? And why were there fresh tire tracks in the snow outside when no one was supposed to know she was here? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elisa's hands shook as she reached for one of the passports. The face staring back at her was definitely Grandpa Ernie, but the name read Ernst Wilhelm. Another bore the name Edward Novak. Each passport showed different countries, different years, but always that same weathered face she'd kissed goodnight as a child. The photographs were worse. Men in expensive suits looking over their shoulders. A woman clutching a briefcase, terror etched in every line of her face. Each image was meticulously labeled with dates and locations spanning decades. Some had red X's drawn across them. "What the hell, Grandpa?" she whispered, her voice echoing in the musty basement. Calix whined again, his ears pricked toward the ceiling. That's when Elisa heard it, the distant rumble of an engine growing closer. Her blood turned to ice. She was 8 miles from the nearest neighbor, accessed only by a winding dirt road that most people didn't even know existed. She quickly gathered the passports and photographs, stuffing them into her jacket. The cash, she counted at least $50,000, went into her purse. Her pregnant belly made her movements awkward, but adrenaline sharpened her focus. The engine sound grew louder, multiple vehicles. Elisa climbed the basement stairs as quietly as possible, Calix pressed against her side. Through the front window's corner, she could see headlights cutting through the late afternoon gloom. 2 black SUVs were slowly making their way up the mountain road. Her mind raced. The cabin had always been Ernie's sanctuary, the place where he'd taught her to fish, to identify animal tracks, to appreciate the silence of snow-covered pines. He'd seemed like such a gentle man, content with his woodworking and his stories about the good old days. Now those stories felt like elaborate lies. The vehicle stopped about a quarter-mile down the road, engines cutting out. They were approaching on foot, a tactical decision that made her stomach clench with fear. Elisa grabbed her keys and headed for the back door, but Calix blocked her path, growling low. He was staring at something she'd missed, a framed photograph on Ernie's mantel that had fallen face down. She flipped it over and gasped. It was a picture of Ernie with a group of men in military fatigues, but not American uniforms. The writing on the back was in what looked like Russian. One face had been carefully scratched out with a pen. Heavy footsteps crunched through snow outside, male voices speaking in hushed tones. She caught fragments, supposed to be empty, and old man hid it somewhere. They were looking for something Ernie had hidden, and they thought she might know where it was. The realization hit her like a physical blow. They hadn't come here by coincidence. Someone had been watching, waiting for her to show up. Elisa pocketed the photograph and eased toward the kitchen, where a back door led to a narrow trail through the woods. Ernie had shown her that trail years ago, telling her it was their secret escape route for when the tax collectors came calling. She'd thought he was joking. The front door handle rattled. Calix stayed pressed against her leg as they slipped outside into the bitter mountain air. Her breath formed clouds in the freezing temperature, and she prayed the men wouldn't see the vapor trail. The trail was treacherous in winter, but she knew it led to an old logging road where her car was parked. Behind her she heard the cabin door splinter open. Voices filled the space she'd just vacated, urgent and angry. They were tearing the place apart, looking for whatever Ernie had left behind. As she navigated the icy path, her baby kicked hard, as if responding to her elevated heart rate. She pressed a protective hand to her belly and whispered, "Hold on, little one." Whatever Grandpa Ernie had been involved in, she was now part of it, and she had no idea who she could trust. The morning fog clung to the mountainside like a shroud as Elisa pulled her rental car up the winding gravel road. Each pothole sent a jolt through her swollen belly, making her 6-month-old passenger shift restlessly. In the passenger seat, Calix whined softly, his golden retriever nose pressed against the window, as unfamiliar scents invaded his senses. "Almost there, boy," she murmured, though she wasn't entirely sure herself. The last time she'd been to Grandpa Ernie's cabin, she was 12 years old, and the journey had seemed magical then, all towering pines and hidden wildlife. Now, pregnant and alone, it felt more like entering a forgotten world. The cabin emerged through the mist like something from a fairy tale, its dark wood exterior weathered but sturdy. Solar panels glinted from the metal roof, a modern addition that surprised her. Grandpa Ernie had always been resourceful, but she remembered him as charmingly old-fashioned, more likely to read by candlelight than embrace new technology. Elisa parked beside a small shed and slowly extracted herself from the driver's seat, one hand supporting her lower back. The mountain air was crisp and thin, carrying the scent of pine needles and something else, something that made Calix's ears perk up with interest. "What is it?" she asked, but the dog was already bounding toward the cabin's front porch, his tail wagging with unusual intensity. The key was exactly where the lawyer had said it would be, tucked beneath a ceramic frog that had clearly seen better days. As she unlocked the door, memories flooded back. Summer mornings making pancakes on Grandpa's wood-burning stove, evenings listening to his stories about the old days back when he worked for some vague government agency he never liked to discuss. The interior was exactly as she remembered, yet somehow smaller. The stone fireplace dominated the main room, flanked by built-in bookshelves packed with volumes on everything from astronomy to military history. His favorite leather chair sat angled toward the window, a pair of reading glasses still folded neatly on the side table. Calix immediately began sniffing around the perimeter of the room, his behavior more methodical than his usual curious exploration. He paused at certain spots, tail rigid, before moving on with obvious purpose. "You're acting weird, even for you," Elisa said, settling into her grandfather's chair. The leather creaked familiarly, and for a moment she could almost smell his pipe tobacco, could almost hear his gentle humming as he worked on one of his mysterious projects. She'd planned to spend the week going through his belongings, deciding what to keep and what to donate. The baby wasn't due for 3 more months, but her doctor had recommended she avoid stress, and somehow being here felt peaceful. Her ex-husband's angry phone calls couldn't reach her on the mountain, and the constant pressure of the divorce proceedings seemed a world away. But as the afternoon wore on, Calix's behavior became increasingly strange. He would sit in front of certain walls and whine softly, pawing at the baseboards as if he could smell something beyond them. When she tried to call him away, he would reluctantly follow, but inevitably return to the same spots. "There's nothing there, silly dog," she said, but doubt crept into her voice. Grandpa Ernie had always been secretive about his work. Even after retirement, he'd maintained habits that seemed oddly cautious, checking locks multiple times, varying his routines, keeping curtains drawn after dark. As evening approached, she made herself a simple dinner from the surprisingly well-stocked pantry. Everything was organized with military precision, canned goods arranged by expiration date, spices labeled in her grandfather's careful handwriting. It was then she noticed something odd. Several items were clearly recent purchases, their dates showing they'd been bought just weeks before his death. But according to the family, Grandpa Ernie hadn't left the cabin inn over a month before he passed. So who had been shopping for him? A sound outside made her freeze. fork halfway to her mouth. It was probably just a branch scraping against the roof, but Calix's reaction suggested otherwise. The dog shot to his feet, every muscle tense, a low growl rumbling in his chest as he stared toward the front door. The sound came again, definitely not natural. It was rhythmic, deliberate, footsteps. Elisa's heart hammered against her ribs as she reached for her phone, only to remember there was no cell service this far up the mountain. The landline Grandpa had mentioned was nowhere to be seen, and suddenly the cabin's isolation felt less peaceful and more terrifying. The footsteps circled the cabin slowly, purposefully, as if someone was looking for something, or someone was making sure she knew they were there. Calix positioned himself between her and the door, hackles raised, that low growl never ceasing. Whatever he sensed out there, it wasn't friendly. And in that moment, Elisa realized that inheriting her grandfather's cabin meant inheriting far more than just his belongings. The morning light filtering through the cabin's grimy windows did nothing to dispel the unease that had settled in Elisa's chest like a stone. She'd barely slept, her mind churning over the contents of that hidden room. Every creak of the old building had her jolting awake, hand instinctively moving to her growing belly. Calix padded over to his food bowl, tail wagging expectantly, blissfully unaware that his discovery had turned her world upside down. She filled his bowl with trembling hands, watching him eat while she tried to make sense of everything. The photographs haunted her most. Grandpa Ernie in what looked like military gear, standing beside men she didn't recognize in locations that seemed foreign and hostile. The timestamps on some photos showed they were taken well into his 70s, long after she thought he'd retired to this quiet mountain retreat to tend his garden and read mystery novels. A sharp knock at the front door made her freeze. Calix's head snapped up, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Through the window she could see a black SUV parked in the driveway, its engine still running. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Another knock, more insistent this time. "Miss Torres?" A man's voice, smooth and professional. "I'm Agent Marcus Webb with the Department of Defense. I'd like to speak with you about your grandfather's estate." Elisa's mouth went dry. She approached the door cautiously, Calix positioning himself protectively at her side. Through the peephole she saw a tall man in a dark suit, his face angular and serious. A woman stood slightly behind him, also professionally dressed, her eyes scanning the surroundings with practiced alertness. "How did you know I was here?" Elisa called through the door. "Property records show the cabin was recently transferred to your name. We tried your San Francisco address first." His tone remained pleasant, but there was an undertone that suggested this wasn't really a request. "This won't take long." Against her better judgment, Elisa unlocked the door but kept the chain engaged, opening it just enough to see them clearly. Agent Webb held up an official-looking badge. "What does the Department of Defense want with my grandfather's estate?" He was just a retired electrician. Something flickered across Webb's face. Amusement, maybe, or pity. "Ma'am, I think there might be some things about Ernest Torres that you weren't aware of. May we come in? It's rather cold out here." The October mountain air was indeed crisp, and Elisa found herself stepping back despite every instinct screaming at her to slam the door. Webb and his partner entered, their eyes immediately taking inventory of the cabin's interior. The woman, who introduced herself as Agent Kim, moved with the fluid grace of someone trained in combat. "Nice place," Webb said, though his gaze was calculating rather than appreciative. "Your grandfather lived here alone for what? 15 years? Something like that." Elisa wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling exposed in her pajamas and robe. "What exactly did you want to know?" "We're trying to locate some materials that belong to your grandfather. Documents, possibly some equipment, items that technically belong to the government." Webb's smile was meant to be reassuring, but came across as predatory. "We're hoping to make this as simple as possible. I haven't found anything like that, just old furniture and personal belongings." Agent Kim had drifted toward the back of the cabin, and Elisa's pulse spiked as she realized the woman was moving in the direction of the bedroom. and the hidden room beyond. You know, Webb continued conversationally, your grandfather was quite remarkable, served his country for over 50 years in various capacities. Much of his work was classified, which is why you probably never heard about it. Calix had been watching the agents with unwavering attention, and now he moved to block Kim's path down the hallway. The woman paused, eyeing the German shepherd warily. "Friendly dog," she commented. "He's protective," Elisa said, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "Especially right now. I'm pregnant, and he seems to sense that." Webb's expression softened marginally. "Congratulations. When are you due?" "Spring." The word came out as barely a whisper. "Well, we certainly don't want to stress you unnecessarily." But even as he spoke, Kim was testing Calix's resolve, taking another step toward the hallway. The dog's growl deepened. "Perhaps you could call him off so Agent Kim can complete her assessment?" Webb suggested. "Assessment of what, exactly?" "Just a routine security sweep, making sure there's nothing here that could pose a danger to you or your baby." The lie came so smoothly that Elisa almost believed it. Almost. But she'd spent enough years as a journalist to recognize when someone was feeding her a line. These people weren't here for her safety. They were here for whatever Grandpa Ernie had hidden in that room. "I think you should leave," she said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. Webb's pleasant mask slipped just slightly. "Miss Torres, I don't think you understand the situation." The morning brought an unsettling quiet that made Elisa's skin crawl. She'd barely slept, jumping at every creak and groan of the old cabin settling. Now, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee, she stared at the manila folders spread before her like pieces of a puzzle she wasn't sure she wanted to solve. Calix whined softly from his spot by the door, ears pricked and alert. He'd been restless too, padding between the kitchen and the living room all night, as if sensing something she couldn't. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, but the dog just tilted his head and continued his anxious vigil. Elisa forced herself to focus on the documents. The passport with Grandpa Ernie's photo, but the name Ernest Morrison instead of Ernest Castellano made her stomach churn. She'd grown up knowing him as Ernie Castellano, the gentle man who taught her to fish and told her bedtime stories about brave princesses. Who was Ernest Morrison? The birth certificate told the same lie. Born in Detroit, 1945. But Grandpa had always said he was from Chicago, had regaled her with tales of growing up near Wrigley Field. Every story, every shared memory. Had it all been fiction? Her fingers trembled as she opened the first folder. Bank statements showed regular deposits of substantial amounts, far more than a retired electrician should have. The account numbers were foreign, routing through banks in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands. Money laundering, her mind whispered, though she tried to push the thought away. The second folder contained photographs that made her blood run cold. Grainy surveillance shots of men in expensive suits, some taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. Notes were scrawled on the backs in Grandpa Ernie's careful handwriting. Russo, launders through Atlantic City, DeMarco, controls shipping lanes, targets for elimination. Elimination. The word sent ice through her veins. A photograph fell from the stack, landing face up on the table. Her grandfather stood beside a man she didn't recognize, both of them smiling at what appeared to be some kind of formal dinner. But it was the third man in the background that made her breath catch. She'd seen his face on the news. Anthony Torino, the alleged crime boss who'd been found dead in his car 3 months ago, execution style. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if responding to her spike of fear. She pressed a protective hand to her belly, mind racing. If Grandpa Ernie had been involved with these people, if he'd known things he shouldn't have known. Calix's low growl snapped her attention back to the present. The dog was standing rigid by the window, hackles raised, staring out at the tree line. Elisa crept over to look, her heart hammering against her chest. A flash of movement caught her eye. Someone in dark clothing disappearing behind the large pine trees that bordered the property. She watched for several minutes, but saw nothing more. just the wind stirring the branches and the morning shadows playing tricks on her paranoid mind. Or was it paranoia? Someone had broken in yesterday, searching for something. The hidden room, the evidence, the money, it all pointed to secrets that people might kill for. She gathered the documents quickly, stuffing them back into the folders. She needed to get these somewhere safe, away from the cabin. But where? Who could she trust with something like this? The sound of an engine made her freeze. Through the kitchen window, she watched a black SUV with tinted windows crawl up the gravel driveway. It moved slowly, deliberately, like a predator stalking its prey. Calix began barking furiously. Elisa grabbed the folders and the duffel bag of cash, her mind working frantically. The hidden room, they might not know about it yet. She could stash everything there and pretend she'd found nothing. The SUV stopped in front of the cabin. Two men got out, both wearing dark suits that looked expensive and out of place in the mountain wilderness. Even from a distance, she could see the bulge of shoulder holsters beneath their jackets. Elisa ran for the hidden room, Calix at her heels. She shoved the evidence back into the safe and slammed it shut, then quickly repositioned the bookcase. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely work the mechanism. By the time the knock came at the front door, she was back in the kitchen, trying to look like she'd been doing nothing more threatening than drinking coffee and reading a magazine. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Coming!" she called out, her voice higher than usual. She walked to the door on unsteady legs, one hand instinctively protecting her belly. Through the peephole she could see one of the men clearly, middle-aged, with cold eyes and a scar running from his left temple to his jaw. When she opened the door, he smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "Miss Castellano? We'd like to talk to you about your grandfather." The storm hit just after midnight, turning the mountain into a symphony of howling wind and driving rain. Elisa jerked awake as thunder crashed overhead, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. The baby responded with a flutter of movement, as if sharing her unease. Lightning illuminated the cabin's interior in stark flashes, casting dancing shadows across the walls. Each burst of light made the familiar furniture seem foreign and menacing. She reached for her phone on the nightstand. No signal. The storm must have knocked out the cell tower. Calix whined from his position by the bedroom door, ears perked and alert. His hackles were raised, a low growl rumbling in his throat that had nothing to do with the weather outside. "What is it, boy?" Elisa whispered, though part of her didn't want to know the answer. Another flash of lightning revealed what had spooked the dog. Through the rain-streaked window, a beam of light swept across the tree line. Then another. Flashlights. Someone was out there, moving deliberately through the forest toward the cabin. Elisa's blood turned to ice. She rolled out of bed as quietly as possible, her pregnant body making stealth difficult. Her mind raced through possibilities. Hikers seeking shelter seemed unlikely in this weather and at this hour. No, whoever was approaching had come specifically for the cabin, for what Grandpa Ernie had hidden. She crawled to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. Two figures in dark rain gear were making their way up the slope, their movements coordinated and purposeful, professional. The way they held their flashlights low and moved in formation reminded her of military operations she'd seen in movies. Calix's growl intensified. Elisa quickly grabbed his muzzle, shushing him. "Quiet," she breathed. "Good boy, but quiet." The smart thing would be to hide, but Elisa found herself thinking about the hidden room, about her grandfather's journals and the photographs that painted him as someone she'd never known. If these people were here for that evidence, she couldn't let them destroy the only connection she had to understanding Ernie's secret life. Moving as silently as her condition allowed, she made her way to the living room. The loose floorboard that concealed the entrance to the hidden room creaked softly as she lifted it. The narrow stairs beckoned, but descending them while pregnant and in the dark seemed impossibly dangerous. Instead, she grabbed the journal she'd been reading and several photographs, shoving them into a waterproof hiking pack she found by the door. Whatever happened next, she needed to preserve this evidence. A soft scraping sound came from the front porch. They were trying the door. Elisa's heart hammered against her ribs as she considered her options. The back door led to a steep slope that would be treacherous in the storm, especially for someone 6 months pregnant. But staying meant confronting whoever had come calling in the dead of night. The front door handle rattled. Locked, but that probably wouldn't stop them for long. Elisa made her decision. She clipped Calix's leash to his collar and shouldered the pack, then moved toward the kitchen and the back exit. Each step seemed impossibly loud despite the storm's cover. Behind her, she heard the unmistakable sound of someone working on the front door lock, not breaking it down, but manipulating it with tools. The back door opened to chaos. Rain lashed her face immediately, and the wind tried to tear the door from her grip. Calix pressed against her legs, reluctant to venture into the storm but loyal enough to follow. Elisa pulled up her hood and stepped into the tempest. The wooden deck was slick with rain, and she gripped the railing tightly as she made her way down the steps. Her destination was the old shed where Grandpa Ernie had kept his truck. If it still ran, she might be able to get down the mountain to somewhere with cell service. Behind her, a light appeared in the cabin's front windows. They were inside. The shed door fought against the wind, but she managed to wrench it open. Grandpa Ernie's ancient pickup sat waiting, keys hanging from a hook just inside the door, exactly where they'd always been. Some things never changed, even when everything else turned upside down. The truck's engine turned over on the third try, rumbling to life with a sound that seemed deafening despite the storm's noise. Calix jumped into the passenger seat as Elisa threw the vehicle into reverse. Through the cabin's windows, she saw the lights moving frantically. They'd heard the engine. As she navigated the treacherous mountain road in the dark, her headlights cutting through sheets of rain, Elisa caught a glimpse of 2 figures emerging from the cabin's back door. She pressed the accelerator, feeling the truck's tires fight for grip on the muddy road. Whatever her grandfather had been involved in, it wasn't over. And now she was carrying more than just his secrets. She was carrying his granddaughter, the next generation to inherit this dangerous legacy. The mountain road stretched ahead, dark and uncertain, leading her away from the only home Grandpa Ernie had ever known and toward answers she wasn't sure she was ready to find. The floorboards groaned under Elisa's weight as she descended into the hidden room, her phone's flashlight cutting through the dusty air. The beam revealed more than she'd glimpsed from above. Filing cabinets lined one wall, their metal surfaces dulled with age, while a corkboard dominated another, covered in what looked like surveillance photos and red string connecting various points, like a conspiracy theorist's fever dream. Calix whimpered from above, his claws scratching against the wooden floor as he paced the opening. The dog's anxiety was palpable, and Elisa felt it mirroring her own mounting dread. This wasn't just some old storage space her grandfather had forgotten to mention. This was deliberate, hidden, secret. She approached the nearest filing cabinet, her free hand trembling as she pulled on the top drawer. Locked. They were all locked, she discovered after testing each one. But the corkboard beckoned, and as she drew closer, the photos resolved into clearer focus under her light. Faces, dozens of them. Some appeared to be surveillance shots taken from a distance. People entering buildings, sitting in cars, walking down streets. Others looked more official, like passport photos or police mugshots. Red string connected various images, creating a web that made no sense to Elisa but clearly held meaning for whoever had constructed it. For Grandpa Ernie. Her phone buzzed with a text message, startling her so badly she nearly dropped it. The notification illuminated the screen, low battery warning, 20% remaining. She cursed under her breath and quickly snapped photos of the corkboard, the flash temporarily blinding her in the confined space. As her vision cleared, something else caught her attention, a desk in the far corner, partially hidden by shadow. She made her way over, each step deliberate and careful. The wooden surface was scarred and worn, covered with papers held down by a paperweight that looked suspiciously like a piece of polished granite from the mountain outside. The papers were maps, not tourist maps or hiking trails, but detailed topographical charts marked with coordinates, dates, and cryptic notations in her grandfather's familiar handwriting. Some locations were circled in red ink, others crossed out entirely. A pattern began to emerge. Many of the marked locations were along the border, remote areas where someone could cross between countries undetected. Elisa's breath caught in her throat. Her grandfather, the man who had taught her to fish and make pancakes on Sunday mornings, had been involved in something that required knowledge of smuggling routes. The thought felt impossible, yet the evidence surrounded her. A loose floorboard creaked overhead, and Calix's whimpering stopped abruptly. Elisa froze, listening. The cabin was old, she told herself. Old buildings made noise, but then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of the front door opening. Someone was in the house. Panic shot through her veins like ice water. She quickly killed the phone's flashlight, plunging the hidden room into complete darkness. Above her, footsteps moved across the kitchen floor, slow and deliberate. Not the casual walk of someone familiar with the space, but the careful progression of someone searching. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing her terror. She pressed her hand to her stomach, trying to calm both herself and the life growing inside her. Think, Elisa. Think. The footsteps paused directly overhead. Whoever was up there had found the open hatch. She could hear them moving the table aside, probably looking down into the space where she crouched like a trapped animal. A beam of light suddenly pierced the darkness, much brighter than her phone's flashlight, professional grade. It swept across the room above her head, and she pressed herself against the filing cabinets, trying to become invisible. The light disappeared, and she heard the unmistakable sound of someone lowering themselves through the opening. Elisa's mind raced through her options. The room appeared to have only one entrance, the hatch above. She was trapped. But as the intruder's feet touched the floor of the hidden room, she remembered something. Grandpa Ernie had been paranoid enough to create this secret space. Had he been paranoid enough to give it a second exit? The powerful flashlight beam began its systematic sweep of the room. In moments, it would find her. She felt along the wall behind her, fingers searching for anything that might indicate another way out. Her hand found something unexpected, a loose panel in the wood. She pressed against it, and it gave way with the slightest pressure. Fresh air hit her face. Another passage, barely wide enough for her pregnant body to squeeze through. She could hear the intruder moving closer, the beam of light growing brighter against the walls around her hiding spot. Without hesitation, she slipped through the opening into whatever lay beyond, one hand protecting her belly, the other extended in front of her into the unknown darkness. Behind her, she heard the intruder's sharp intake of breath as they discovered the filing cabinets and realized what they'd found. The floorboards creaked beneath Elisa's feet as she paced the cabin's main room, her phone pressed to her ear. The morning light filtering through the windows did nothing to ease the knots in her stomach. "Marcus, I need you to listen to me," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Something's happening here that I don't understand." Her boyfriend's voice crackled through the spotty connection. "Elisa, you're scaring me. What kind of something?" She glanced toward the hidden room, its entrance now sealed behind the bookshelf. Last night, she'd spent hours photographing everything before carefully returning it to its original state. The images on her phone felt surreal, passport after passport bearing her grandfather's face, but different names, bundles of foreign currency, and weapons she couldn't even identify. "I found things about Grandpa Ernie, things that don't make sense." She paused, watching Calix nose around the front door, his ears pricked with alert attention. "Marcus, what if everything we thought we knew about him was wrong?" The line went quiet for a moment. "Elisa, grief can make us see things differently. Maybe this isn't grief." Her voice came out sharper than intended. "Someone broke into the cabin yesterday. They were looking for something specific." "What?" Marcus's tone shifted immediately. "Are you okay? Did you call the police?" Before she could answer, Calix began growling low in his throat, his body rigid as he stared at the door. Elisa's blood chilled. She'd learned to trust the dog's instincts completely since arriving at the cabin. "Marcus, I have to go," she whispered, ending the call and sliding the phone into her pocket. She crept toward the window, careful to stay out of sight. Through the glass, she could see a black SUV parked at the edge of the tree line, the same vehicle from yesterday. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched two figures emerge. The woman with short grey hair moved with military precision, while her companion scanned the area with practiced eyes. They weren't here by accident. Elisa's mind raced through her options. The back door led to a narrow trail that wound down the mountain, but in her condition, she couldn't move fast enough to outrun them. Her car keys sat on the kitchen counter, but the vehicle was parked directly in their line of sight. The sound of footsteps on the front porch made her decision for her. Moving as quietly as possible, she grabbed Calix by the collar and headed for the bedroom. The window there opened onto a small overhang above the woodshed. Not ideal for a pregnant woman, but better than facing whatever these people wanted. A sharp knock echoed through the cabin. "Miss Rodriguez? We'd like to speak with you about your grandfather." The voice was female, professional, but carried an undertone that made Elisa's skin crawl. She eased the bedroom window open, grateful when it didn't creak. The drop to the woodshed roof looked manageable, but getting Calix down would be another challenge. "We know you're inside," the voice continued. "We're not here to hurt you. We just need to discuss Ernest Martinez's final arrangements." Ernest Martinez. Not Ernest Rodriguez, the name she'd known her entire life. Another lie, another piece of the puzzle that didn't fit the grandfather who taught her to fish and told her bedtime stories about brave princesses. The doorknob rattled. They were testing whether it was locked. Elisa hoisted one leg over the windowsill, her movements awkward with her growing belly. She gestured for Calix to stay quiet, then carefully lowered herself until she was hanging by her fingertips. The drop to the shed roof sent a jolt through her knees, but she landed safely. Calix whined softly from the window above. The sound of splintering wood from the front of the cabin told her they were done being polite. She couldn't leave him behind. "Come on, boy," she whispered urgently, patting her leg. The dog didn't hesitate. He leaped down, landing heavily beside her with better grace than she'd managed. Together, they scrambled to the edge of the woodshed roof and dropped to the ground behind the cabin. The forest pressed close here, offering immediate cover. Elisa grabbed Calix's collar again and plunged into the trees, following a deer path she'd noticed during yesterday's exploration. Branches caught at her clothes, and her breathing came in sharp gasps, but she forced herself to keep moving. Behind her, she could hear voices from inside the cabin, growing more agitated. They were searching room by room, probably wondering how she'd vanished so completely. 20 yards into the trees, she stopped and turned back. Through the cabin's windows, she could see figures moving methodically through her grandfather's home. They knew what they were looking for, and they wouldn't stop until they found it. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, called the local sheriff. "Help is coming." Elisa stared at the message, then at the strangers ransacking her inheritance. Sheriff's deputies were at least 30 minutes away, and somehow she doubted these people would wait around for law enforcement to arrive. The baby kicked, a reminder of exactly how much she had to lose. The morning air bit at Elisa's cheeks as she stood on the cabin's front porch, watching Detective Morrison's patrol car disappear down the winding mountain road. Her hands trembled as she wrapped them around her coffee mug, though whether from cold or nerves she couldn't tell. Calix pressed against her legs, his warm body a small comfort in the growing uncertainty that seemed to surround everything. She'd barely slept after finding the surveillance photos. Every creak of the old cabin had her sitting bolt upright, heart hammering against her ribs. The baby had been restless too, as if sensing her anxiety through some invisible connection. Now, in the harsh light of day, the events of the past week felt surreal, like scenes from someone else's life. Detective Morrison had been thorough but guarded when he'd arrived an hour earlier. He'd examined the hidden room with professional detachment, photographing everything, bagging the photos and documents she'd discovered. When she'd asked what it all meant, his answer had been frustratingly vague. "We'll need time to analyze everything, Mrs. Chen. Your grandfather's activities appear to have been more complex than anyone realized. Complex. That was one way to put it. Another way was to say that the man who'd taught her to fish and carve wooden animals had apparently been living a life she couldn't even begin to comprehend. Calix suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked toward the tree line. A low growl rumbled in his throat, and Elisa felt her pulse quicken. She scanned the forest but saw nothing except pine trees swaying in the morning breeze. Still, the dog's instincts had proven reliable so far. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, moving toward the cabin door. Calix remained frozen, his attention fixed on something she couldn't see. The sound of an approaching vehicle made her stomach drop. Too soon for Detective Morrison to be returning. The engine noise grew louder, and through the trees she caught glimpses of a dark SUV navigating the narrow road, not a vehicle she recognized. Fear shot through her veins like ice water. She grabbed Calix's collar and pulled him inside, quickly locking the door behind them. The SUV's engine cut off somewhere near the driveway, followed by the slam of car doors, male voices speaking too quietly for her to make out words. Elisa's mind raced. Her phone sat on the kitchen counter, but would she have time to call for help? The nearest neighbor was miles away, and Detective Morrison was probably already back in town. She pressed herself against the window, trying to see past the porch overhang. Two men in dark clothing were walking toward the cabin with purposeful strides. The taller one had salt and pepper hair and moved with military precision. The other was younger, stockier, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Neither looked like they were here for a friendly visit. A sharp knock echoed through the cabin. "Mrs. Chen? We'd like to speak with you about your grandfather." Elisa's breath caught. They knew who she was. How long had they been watching? She thought about the surveillance photos Morrison had taken, wondered if these were the same people who'd been photographing Grandpa Ernie. "Mrs. Chen, we know you're inside. We're not here to hurt you. We just need to retrieve something that belongs to us." The calm tone of the voice somehow made it worse. These weren't random burglars or desperate addicts. They were professionals, and they wanted something specific. Something they believed Grandpa Ernie had taken. Calix growled again, positioning himself between Elisa and the door. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if protesting the tension flooding her system. She placed a protective hand over her belly and tried to think clearly. Another knock, more insistent this time. "Mrs. Chen, your grandfather had something that doesn't belong to him. We'd prefer to handle this civilly, but we will get what we came for." The threat was unmistakable despite the polite delivery. Elisa's eyes darted to the back door, wondering if she could slip out unseen. But what if there were more of them? What if they'd already surrounded the cabin? Her phone buzzed with an incoming text. With shaking fingers, she grabbed it from the counter. Detective Morrison found something important in the documents. "Don't trust anyone until I get back. Stay inside and keep doors locked." Too late for that advice, she thought grimly. The men outside had moved to the windows now, trying to peer through the curtains she'd thankfully kept drawn. Their footsteps creaked across the wooden porch as they circled the cabin like predators. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way, Mrs. Chen," the voice called out. "But we're not leaving empty-handed." Elisa closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing. Whatever Grandpa Ernie had gotten himself involved in, whatever secrets he'd hidden in that room, the consequences were now hers to face. She was alone on a mountain with two dangerous strangers, carrying secrets she didn't understand, and a baby who depended entirely on her survival. The sound of breaking glass from the back of the cabin told her the talking was over. The morning sun cast long shadows through the cabin windows as Elisa sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open beside a steaming cup of herbal tea. The USB drive from the hidden room lay next to her mouse, its innocent appearance belying the secrets it contained. She'd barely slept, her mind racing with questions about the encrypted files and what Marcus might be planning. Calix lifted his head from his spot by the fireplace, ears perked toward the front door. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "What is it, boy?" Elisa whispered, closing the laptop. Through the window, she caught a glimpse of movement in the tree line. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she remembered Agent Chen's warning about staying vigilant. The growl intensified. Calix rose to his feet, hackles raised, positioning himself between Elisa and the door. A knock echoed through the cabin. 3 deliberate raps that made Elisa jump. She grabbed the USB drive, shoving it into her pocket as she approached the window cautiously. A woman in hiking gear stood on the porch, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She looked to be in her 40s, with the weathered complexion of someone who spent considerable time outdoors. "Miss Morrison," the woman called out. "I'm Dr. Sarah Fleming from the university. I worked with your grandfather on several research projects." Elisa hesitated. Chen had told her to trust no one, but the woman seemed harmless enough. Still, Grandpa Ernie's research had turned out to be far more complicated than anyone had imagined. "What kind of research?" Elisa asked through the door. "Archaeological surveys of the region. Your grandfather was quite knowledgeable about the local history." Dr. Fleming's voice carried a note of genuine affection. "I heard about his passing and wanted to offer my condolences. We were supposed to meet last month, but he cancelled unexpectedly." The timing made Elisa's stomach clench. Last month was around when Grandpa Ernie had started acting strangely during their phone calls, when his stories had become more scattered and paranoid. Against her better judgment, Elisa unlocked the door but kept the chain latch engaged, opening it just enough to see the woman's face. Dr. Fleming's eyes were kind, crinkled at the corners with laugh lines, but something about her stance seemed too alert, too controlled. "I'm sorry for your loss," Dr. Fleming said, noticing Elisa's cautious positioning. "I understand your grandfather meant a great deal to you. He talked about you often, about how proud he was of your pregnancy." The personal details should have been reassuring, but instead it sent ice through Elisa's veins. She'd never told Grandpa Ernie about the baby. She'd planned to surprise him during this very trip. "I think there's been some mistake," Elisa said carefully. "My grandfather didn't know about the pregnancy." Dr. Fleming's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. "Of course, I must be thinking of someone else. May I come in? I have something that belonged to your grandfather. Some notes he left at the university." Calix's growling intensified. The dog pressed against Elisa's legs, his body tense with warning. In her peripheral vision, Elisa caught movement near the cabin's back entrance. Her pulse spiked as she realized this might be a coordinated approach. "I'm sorry, but this isn't a good time," Elisa said, starting to close the door. Dr. Fleming's hand shot out, stopping the door's movement. Her grip was strong, her knuckles scarred in a way that suggested more than academic work. "Miss Morrison, I really think we should talk. Your grandfather was involved in some important work, and there are people who would pay handsomely for his research." The pretense was gone now. Elisa threw her weight against the door, but Dr. Fleming was stronger and had better leverage. Through the gap, Elisa could see the woman's other hand moving towards something concealed beneath her jacket. "Calix, protect," Elisa commanded. The German shepherd launched himself at the door with a fierce bark. The sudden appearance of 90 pounds of snarling dog made Dr. Fleming stumble backward, releasing her grip. Elisa slammed the door shut and threw the deadbolt. "Miss Morrison, don't make this difficult," Dr. Fleming called out. "We know what your grandfather was hiding. We know about the room. Just give us what we're looking for, and no one gets hurt." Elisa's hands shook as she grabbed her phone, but there was no signal. The landline cord had been cut. She could see the severed wire hanging beside the kitchen wall. They'd been planning this. Through the back window, she spotted 2 figures approaching through the trees. They moved with military precision, communicating through hand signals. These weren't academics or treasure hunters. They were professionals. Elisa's mind raced through her options. The hidden room might offer temporary shelter, but it could also become a trap. The mountain paths were treacherous for someone in her condition, but staying here meant facing whatever these people had planned. She grabbed the emergency bag she'd prepared, checking that the USB drive was secure in her pocket. Calix stayed close, his alert posture showing he understood the danger. Outside, Dr. Fleming's voice had been replaced by harsh whispers and the sound of equipment being prepared. Time was running out. The drive down the mountain felt like descending into another world. Elisa gripped the steering wheel tighter as each mile put distance between her and the cabin that had become both sanctuary and prison. Beside her, the manila envelope containing copies of her grandfather's most damning evidence seemed to radiate heat through her jacket pocket. Marcus had been right about one thing: she couldn't stay hidden forever. But his solution of handing everything over to shadowy federal contacts felt like trading one form of captivity for another. She needed answers before she surrendered control completely. Calix whined softly from the back seat, his head pressed against the window as familiar scents of civilization began filtering through the vents. The dog had been restless since they'd left, as if he too sensed they were walking into danger rather than away from it. The town of Cedar Ridge looked exactly as Elisa remembered from childhood visits, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a main street that time had politely ignored. She parked outside Mel's Diner, the same establishment where Grandpa Ernie used to buy her chocolate milkshakes and tell her stories about his boring work as a traveling salesman. How many of those stories had been lies? How many times had he sat across from her, spinning tales of mundane business trips while hiding the truth about arms dealers and international conspiracies? The bell above the diner door chimed as she entered, and conversations paused just long enough for curious eyes to catalogue the stranger. Small towns never forgot a face, but they were slower to trust returning ones. Elisa chose a corner booth and ordered coffee she didn't want while scanning the other patrons. An elderly man at the counter caught her attention, not because he was threatening, but because he wasn't. Something about his careful posture and the way his eyes swept the room reminded her of Grandpa Ernie, another harmless-looking person with secrets, perhaps. Elisa Cartwright? She turned to find a woman about her age approaching the booth. Blonde hair, kind smile. But there was something calculated in her approach that made Elisa's pulse quicken. "I'm sorry. Do we know each other?" "Sarah Martinez. I work for the county assessor's office." The woman slid into the opposite seat uninvited. "I've been trying to reach you about your grandfather's property." Elisa forced herself to remain calm. "I wasn't aware there were any issues with the cabin." "Oh, there aren't. Not yet." Sarah's smile never wavered, but her voice carried an edge. "It's just that certain parties have expressed interest in purchasing the land. Very generous offers, actually. The kind that could set you up nicely for when the baby comes." The casual mention of her pregnancy sent ice through Elisa's veins. She hadn't told anyone in town about her condition, and while it was becoming visible, it wasn't obvious enough for a stranger to comment on so casually. "I'm not interested in selling." "That's unfortunate." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "Because the people I represent aren't really the type to take no for an answer. They've been very patient, but patience has limits." Elisa's hand moved instinctively to her jacket pocket, feeling the outline of the envelope. "Who exactly do you represent?" "People who knew your grandfather well. People who understand that he took something that didn't belong to him when he retired from his previous career." Sarah's mask was slipping now, revealing something harder underneath. "They've been respectful of the mourning period, but it's time to conclude his unfinished business. And if I refuse—" Sarah's gaze drifted to the parking lot where Elisa's car was visible through the window. "That would be unfortunate for everyone involved, especially in your condition." The threat hung in the air between them like smoke. Elisa felt the familiar surge of protectiveness she'd experienced at the cabin, but this time it was mixed with a cold anger that surprised her. These people had turned her grandfather's legacy into a weapon, and now they were using her unborn child as leverage. "I need time to think." "Of course." Sarah stood gracefully. "But not too much time. My employers aren't known for their patience, and winter's coming early this year. Mountain roads can be so dangerous when the weather turns." After Sarah left, Elisa sat motionless for several minutes, her untouched coffee growing cold. Through the window, she watched the woman get into a black SUV that looked far too expensive for a county employee's salary. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Any problems?" She started to type a response, then stopped. Sarah Martinez and her employers were clearly monitoring her movements, which meant they might be monitoring her communications as well. Marcus's federal contacts suddenly seemed less like a trap and more like a lifeline. But first, she needed to understand exactly what Grandpa Ernie had taken and why it was worth threatening a pregnant woman to get back. The answers weren't in his hidden room. They were in the places he'd gone and the people he'd met during his double life. Elisa left money on the table and walked out into the crisp mountain air, her decision crystallizing with each step toward her car. The morning light filtered through the cabin's dusty windows as Elisa sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee she couldn't bring herself to finish. The journals lay open before her, their pages filled with Grandpa Ernie's careful handwriting that detailed decades of secrets she was still struggling to comprehend. Calix dozed at her feet, occasionally twitching as he chased dream rabbits through mountain meadows. She had spent most of the night reading, piecing together fragments of her grandfather's clandestine life. Arms deals, covert operations, coded messages that referenced locations across 3 continents. The man she remembered making her pancakes and teaching her to fish had been someone else entirely during those long absences she'd accepted as business trips. A soft knock at the front door made both Elisa and Calix freeze. The dog's ears perked up, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Elisa's heart hammered against her ribs as she carefully closed the journal and slipped it beneath a dish towel. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Miss Chen," an unfamiliar woman's voice called through the door. "I'm Detective Sarah Morrison with the County Sheriff's Department. I'd like to speak with you about your grandfather's property." Elisa exchanged a glance with Calix, who had risen to his feet, his hackles slightly raised. She approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. A middle-aged woman in a dark blazer stood on the porch, her badge visible on her belt, but something about her posture seemed off, too rigid, too alert. "What about the property?" Elisa called through the door. "There have been some reports of suspicious activity in the area, break-ins at vacant cabins. I need to ask you some questions and maybe take a look around, make sure everything's secure." Elisa's mind raced. The timing felt wrong. After everything that had happened with Marcus, with the hidden room, with the discovery of those documents, this felt like too much of a coincidence. She pressed her back against the door, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward. "Do you have identification? Can you slide it under the door?" A pause. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to open the door. This is official police business." The authority in the woman's voice wavered just enough to confirm Elisa's suspicions. Real police officers didn't usually sound like they were trying to convince themselves of their own legitimacy. She backed away from the door, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach. "I'm sorry, but I'm not comfortable opening the door right now. You can call the main house and speak with my husband if you need to verify anything about our stay here." The silence that followed stretched too long. Elisa could hear soft footsteps moving across the porch, circling toward the back of the cabin. Calix's growl intensified, and he moved to position himself between Elisa and the rear windows. Panic flooded her system as she realized the woman wasn't leaving. Instead, she was doing exactly what someone would do if they were planning to find another way inside. Elisa grabbed her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed David's number. It went straight to voicemail. "David, someone's here claiming to be police, but I think they're lying. I'm scared. Please call me back." She tried 911 next, but the call wouldn't connect. The cell signal that had been weak but functional yesterday seemed to have disappeared entirely. Through the back window, she caught a glimpse of movement among the trees. The woman wasn't alone. Elisa's breathing became shallow as adrenaline coursed through her body. She thought of the baby, of the stress hormones flooding her system, and forced herself to take deeper breaths. She needed to think clearly. The hidden room. If these people were after what Grandpa Ernie had left behind, they might not know about the concealed entrance. She could hide there with the documents until help arrived, or until she could figure out how to contact the outside world. Moving as quietly as possible, she gathered the journals and the manila envelope from the kitchen table. Calix followed her toward the bedroom, his ears constantly swiveling to track sounds from outside. The floorboard creaked as Elisa pressed it, and the hidden panels swung open with what seemed like thunderous noise in the cabin's stillness. She slipped inside the cramped space, Calix pressed against her legs. The panel closed behind them, plunging them into complete darkness, except for the thin line of light around the edges. Elisa fumbled for the small flashlight she'd found in the room the day before, clicking it on at its lowest setting. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the cabin above them. They were inside now, no longer pretending to be conducting official business. Heavy footsteps moved across the floor, accompanied by voices she couldn't quite make out through the hidden room's walls. Elisa clutched the journals against her chest and tried to calm her racing heart. Whatever her grandfather had been involved in, whatever he had hidden in this mountain refuge, people were willing to break the law to get it back, and she was trapped beneath the floorboards with secrets she barely understood and a baby who deserved to be born into a world much safer than this one. The sound of approaching engines cut through the mountain silence like chainsaws through timber. Elisa's blood turned to ice as she peered through the cabin's front window, watching 3 black SUVs wind their way up the narrow access road. These weren't the careful, cautious movements of Marcus and his team. These vehicles moved with aggressive purpose, kicking up clouds of dust in their wake. "They found us," Marcus said, appearing beside her with his rifle already in hand. "How many rounds do you have left?" Elisa checked the pistol he'd given her earlier. 6. Make them count. His jaw was set in a grim line. "Sarah, take Elisa and get to the hidden room. Lock it from the inside and don't come out no matter what you hear. I'm not leaving you to—" "That's an order!" Marcus's voice brooked no argument. "Those files are bigger than any of us. If something happens to me, you get them to Agent Morrison in Denver. Promise me." Sarah grabbed Elisa's arm, but she resisted. Through the window, she could see armed figures emerging from the vehicles, spreading out with military precision. Calix whined beside her, sensing the danger that hung in the air like smoke. "What about Calix?" Elisa asked. "The dog comes with you," Marcus said, already moving toward the back of the cabin. "Go, now." The first gunshot shattered the morning calm before they reached the hidden room. Elisa's heart hammered against her ribs as Sarah yanked open the concealed door and shoved her inside. Calix bounded in after them, and Sarah slammed the door shut, engaging the heavy deadbolt that Grandpa Ernie had installed. The room plunged into darkness until Sarah found the battery-powered lantern. In the pale lead glow, surrounded by her grandfather's secrets, Elisa felt the weight of 3 generations pressing down on her shoulders. The baby kicked hard, as if responding to her elevated stress. Outside, the gunfire intensified. Automatic weapons joined the symphony of violence, their rapid-fire bursts making the cabin walls shudder. Elisa pressed her hands over her ears, but she couldn't block out the sounds of Marcus shouting orders to his team, or the crash of breaking glass as windows exploded inward. "How long can they hold them off?" she whispered. Sarah was checking her own weapon, her face pale but determined. "Not long enough." She looked around the room, taking inventory of their surroundings. "There has to be another way out. Your grandfather was too smart to build himself a trap." They began searching frantically, running their hands along the walls, looking for any sign of a second exit. Calix whined and pawed at a section of the back wall where the wooden panels didn't quite align. Elisa knelt beside him, ignoring the protest from her swollen belly, and pressed against the wood. It gave slightly under pressure. "Here," she breathed. "There's something here." Sarah joined her, and together they found the hidden mechanism, a simple lever disguised as a wall support beam. When Sarah pulled it, a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow tunnel that disappeared into darkness. The gunfire outside had stopped. In the sudden silence, they could hear heavy footsteps moving through the cabin above, along with rough voices speaking in what sounded like Russian. "They're inside," Sarah mouthed silently. A new voice cut through the air, cold, accented, familiar. Dmitri Volkov had arrived. "Search every room," he commanded. The old man was clever, but not clever enough. The woman is here somewhere, and she has what we need." Elisa's hand instinctively moved to her belly, protecting the child within. She thought of her grandfather, of all the secrets he'd carried to keep his family safe, and felt a surge of fierce determination. Whatever he'd died protecting, she wouldn't let it fall into these hands. Sarah was already moving into the tunnel, motioning for Elisa to follow. The space was barely wide enough for one person, clearly designed as an emergency escape route. Calix hesitated at the entrance, looking back toward the hidden door, as if sensing Marcus's presence somewhere beyond. "Come on, boy," Elisa whispered. "We have to go." They crawled through the tunnel in single file, the musty smell of earth and old wood filling their nostrils. Behind them, they heard the sound of furniture being overturned, of Volkov's men systematically destroying everything in their search. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, sloping gently downward into the mountain. Elisa's knees ached from crawling, and her back screamed in protest, but she pushed forward. The baby seemed to understand the gravity of their situation, remaining still as they made their escape. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they saw light ahead, not artificial light, but the grey dawn filtering through what looked like a camouflaged exit. They emerged into a small clearing about 100 yards downhill from the cabin, hidden from view by a thick stand of pine trees. From their vantage point, they could see smoke beginning to curl from the cabin's windows. Volkov wasn't just searching now, he was destroying the evidence of his presence. The thunder that had been rumbling in the distance finally arrived with a vengeance, rattling the cabin's windows as sheets of rain hammered against the roof. Elisa sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by the contents of the metal box they'd retrieved from the woods. Marcus paced near the fireplace, while Detective Chen examined each document with methodical precision. "This changes everything," Chen muttered, holding up a photograph of a younger Ernest Morrison shaking hands with a man in an expensive suit. The timestamp showed it was taken 3 years ago. "Your grandfather wasn't just documenting their operation, he was part of it." Elisa's stomach churned, and not from morning sickness. "That's impossible. Grandpa Ernie was the most honest man I knew. He wouldn't hurt a fly." "People aren't always who we think they are," Marcus said gently, though his jaw was tight. "Especially when they're protecting someone they love." Chen spread out a series of bank statements showing regular deposits of large sums into an account under Ernest's name. "Look at the dates. These payments correspond with major drug shipments through the mountain passes. Your grandfather was being paid to look the other way." Thunder crashed overhead, and Calix whined from his spot near the door. The dog had been restless all evening, occasionally pawing at the entrance as if sensing something beyond the storm. "There has to be more to it," Elisa insisted, her voice cracking. "Maybe he was undercover, or maybe someone was blackmailing him." Chen pulled out another document, a handwritten letter in Ernest's familiar scrawl. This might explain everything. She cleared her throat and began reading aloud. "To my dearest Elisa, if you're reading this, then they've found me and I'm gone. I know you'll think less of me when you learn the truth, but everything I did was to protect you and your mother. When your father died and left you both with nothing, I made a deal with the devil. They needed someone local to provide safe passage through the mountains, and I needed money for your mother's cancer treatments." Elisa's hand flew to her mouth. She remembered those final months of her mother's illness, the experimental treatments that insurance wouldn't cover. The way Grandpa Ernie had somehow always managed to pay for everything despite his modest pension. "There's more," Chen continued. "I told myself it was temporary, just until the medical bills were paid. But once you're in with people like Viktor Kozlov, there's no clean exit. They owned me for 15 years, but I never stopped documenting everything, hoping someday I could make it right. The evidence in this box should be enough to bring down their entire network. I'm sorry I couldn't be the man you believed me to be, but I hope you understand that love makes us do impossible things." The room fell silent except for the storm's fury. Elisa felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she processed this new reality. Her grandfather, her hero, had been a criminal, but only because he'd loved her family too much to watch them suffer. Marcus knelt beside her, pulling her into his arms. He was still the man who taught you to fish and told you bedtime stories. This doesn't erase any of that. A sudden bang from the back of the cabin made them all freeze. Chen immediately drew her weapon, motioning for silence. Calix growled low in his throat, his hackles rising. "Could be just the storm," Marcus whispered, but his hand was already reaching for the poker near the fireplace. Another crash, this time definitely from inside the cabin. The sound of footsteps creaking across the kitchen floorboards made Chen motion urgently toward the hidden room. "Get down there, now!" But before they could move, a familiar voice called out through the storm noise. "Elisa, are you all right in there? Dr. Patterson?" Elisa called back, confused. What was her obstetrician doing here in the middle of a thunderstorm? Chen kept her weapon drawn but lowered it slightly. "How did he know where to find you?" The pieces clicked together in Elisa's mind with horrible clarity. Dr. Patterson had been asking too many questions about her grandfather's property. He'd known she was staying at the cabin, despite her not mentioning it during her last appointment, and Victor had known exactly when and where to find them. "He's working with them," she breathed. "Dr. Patterson is part of Kozlov's network." The footsteps were closer now, accompanied by at least 2 other sets of boots. Chen grabbed the metal box and shoved it toward Marcus. "Hidden room. Both of you. I'll hold them off." "We're not leaving you," Marcus protested. "That's an order," Chen snapped. "Those documents are the only way to stop this permanently. Keep them safe." The front door exploded inward just as Marcus pulled Elisa toward the concealed entrance. Through the chaos of splintering wood and shouting voices, she caught a glimpse of Dr. Patterson's face, no longer kind and reassuring, but cold and determined. As they disappeared into the darkness below, Elisa heard gunshots erupting above them. The wind howled through the pines as Elisa crouched behind the woodshed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Calix pressed close to her side, his muscles coiled and ready. Through the trees she could see the dark shapes moving toward the cabin, 3 figures advancing with military precision. Her phone had no signal. The landline was cut. Whatever Grandpa Ernie had hidden in that room, these people wanted it badly enough to track her to this remote wilderness. "We know you're here, Elisa," the voice carried on the wind, calm and authoritative. "We just want to talk. Your grandfather had something that belongs to us." She bit back a bitter laugh. "Talk, right. That's why they disabled her truck and surrounded the cabin like wolves circling prey." The baby shifted restlessly in her belly as if sensing the danger. Elisa placed a protective hand over the bump, her mind racing. The evidence room was her ace in the hole, but first she had to survive long enough to use it. A branch snapped somewhere to her left. Calix's ears pricked forward, his lips pulling back in a silent snarl. The figures were spreading out, trying to flank her position. Elisa closed her eyes, remembering every detail of Grandpa Ernie's property. He'd taught her these woods when she was young, every deer trail, every hidden ravine, every secret the mountain held. If she could reach the old mine shaft 1/2 mile up the ridge, she might be able to double back and call for help from the neighboring ranch. But that meant leaving Calix behind. The German Shepherd was fast, but not fast enough to navigate the treacherous mountain terrain in the dark while pregnant. "I'm going to count to 10, the voice called out. "Then we're coming in." Elisa's fingers found the spare key to the cabin that she'd hidden under a loose stone. If she could create a distraction, maybe she could slip inside and barricade herself in the evidence room long enough to figure out her grandfather's final message. 1. She studied the approaching shadows. The leader was moving toward the front porch, while his companions circled around back. Classic pincer movement. 2. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. "Sometimes the best hiding place is right in plain sight, little bird." 3. A plan began to form. Dangerous, but it might work. 4. Elisa whispered a command to Calix, pointing toward the tree line. The dog's ears drooped. He didn't want to leave her, but years of training kicked in. He melted into the shadows, positioning himself where she'd indicated. 5. She crept toward the back of the woodshed, her movements careful and deliberate despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. 6. The window. Grandpa Ernie's bedroom window had a broken latch that looked secure but could be opened from the outside if you knew the trick. She'd discovered it during a game of hide-and-seek when she was 8. 7. One of the flanking figures was almost close enough to spot her. Elisa held her breath, pressing herself against the weathered wood of the shed. 8. Now. It had to be now. She grabbed a heavy chunk of firewood and hurled it toward the front of the cabin. It crashed against the porch railing with a satisfying clatter. Immediately, all 3 figures converged on the sound, their flashlight beams dancing across the front entrance. Elisa sprinted for the cabin's back wall, her boots sliding on the pine needles. Behind her, she heard confused voices as they realized they'd been fooled. She had maybe 30 seconds before they regrouped. Her fingers found the bedroom window, working the familiar trick her grandfather had never bothered to fix. The frame slid open silently, and she hauled herself through with a grace that surprised her. Pregnancy hadn't slowed her down as much as she'd feared. The bedroom was pitch black, but she knew it by heart. 3 steps to the door, turn left, 12 steps to the kitchen, then down to the basement and the hidden room. Heavy footsteps pounded up the front porch. Someone rattled the door handle, testing the locks. Elisa reached the kitchen just as the front window exploded inward. Glass scattered across the floor as dark shapes poured through the opening. She dropped to her hands and knees, crawling toward the basement stairs as flashlight beams swept overhead. "Check every room," the leader barked. "She's here somewhere." The basement door creaked as she opened it. Too loud. Footsteps immediately changed direction, heading her way. Elisa half fell down the stairs, her hands groping for the hidden panel. Behind her, boots thundered across the kitchen floor. Her fingers found the concealed switch just as the first flashlight beam hit the top of the stairs. The panel slid open and she dove through, sealing it behind her just as her pursuers reached the basement. In the absolute darkness of Grandpa Ernie's secret room, surrounded by decades of carefully documented evidence, Elisa finally understood what she was truly fighting for. The morning light filtered through the cabin's dusty windows as Elisa pressed her back against the kitchen wall, listening to the deliberate footsteps circling the perimeter outside. Calix remained pressed against her leg, his body tense but silent, as if he understood the gravity of their situation. The footsteps had started 20 minutes ago, slow, methodical, searching. She clutched the satellite phone Marcus had given her, but the bars showed no signal. The storm had knocked out the cellular tower, leaving them completely isolated. Her grandfather's journal lay open on the counter, its pages revealing more secrets with each entry she'd managed to read through the night. Ernest Kowalski hadn't just been involved in intelligence work, he'd been a handler for foreign assets, people whose lives depended on the information he'd gathered and protected. The footsteps stopped directly outside the kitchen window. Elisa held her breath, one hand instinctively moving to her rounded belly. Through a gap in the curtains, she caught a glimpse of a figure dressed in dark tactical gear, face obscured by a balaclava. This wasn't Marcus or Sheriff Collins, this was someone else entirely. A soft scratching sound came from the front door, someone working on the lock. Elisa's mind raced through her options. The hidden room was too far away, and she'd be trapped there anyway. The back door led directly into the woods, but in her condition, she couldn't outrun anyone. Her eyes landed on the cellar door beside the refrigerator. She'd never explored it fully, but Grandpa Ernie had mentioned it connected to an old root cellar that extended beyond the cabin's foundation. Moving as quietly as possible, she eased the cellar door open. The wooden steps creaked softly under her weight as she descended, Calix following close behind. The musty air carried the scent of earth and aged wood. At the bottom, her flashlight revealed stone walls and several passages branching off from the main area. This wasn't just a root cellar, it was part of a larger tunnel system. Above them, the front door opened with a soft click. Multiple sets of footsteps entered the cabin, moving with practiced stealth. Voices carried down through the floorboards, speaking in what sounded like Russian. Elisa's blood chilled as she remembered her grandfather's journal entries about the Eastern European contacts he'd worked with decades ago. She was here recently. a voice said in accented English. "The fire is still warm. Find the documents," another voice replied. "Kowalski's handler files are worth more than the girl, but we need both." Elisa pressed deeper into the tunnels, following the passage that seemed to lead away from the cabin. The flashlight beam revealed carved initials and dates on the walls, some going back to the 1940s. Her grandfather hadn't just used this place as a retreat, it had been a safe house, part of an underground network that had operated for generations. The tunnel curved sharply to the right, and suddenly she found herself in a larger chamber carved directly from the mountain rock. Emergency supplies lined wooden shelves, water, canned goods, first aid equipment, and what looked like radio equipment from several different eras. A newer addition sat on a central table, a laptop computer, and what appeared to be an encrypted hard drive. Calix growled softly, his ears perked toward the tunnel entrance. The searchers had found the cellar. Flashlight beams began probing the tunnels, growing stronger as they approached. Elisa quickly grabbed the hard drive and laptop, stuffing them into an emergency backpack she found hanging on the wall. Whatever information her grandfather had died protecting, she couldn't let it fall into the wrong hands. A narrow passage at the far end of the chamber caught her attention. Unlike the others, this one angled upward, carved steps leading into darkness. She had no choice but to trust that her grandfather's planning extended beyond what she could see. With Calix beside her, she began climbing the steep passage. Her breathing labored from the combination of pregnancy and exertion. Behind them, voices echoed in the chamber they'd just left. "She's been here. The equipment's been disturbed. The pursuit was gaining ground." The passage seemed to climb forever, but finally opened into natural cave formations. Cool air touched her face, carrying the scent of pine and rain. They were somewhere on the mountainside, far from the cabin. Through a narrow opening between the rocks, she could see the valley spread below and the winding road that led back to civilization. But as she emerged from the cave entrance, hidden among a cluster of boulders, movement in the forest below caught her eye. More figures in tactical gear were positioned along the mountain road, effectively cutting off any escape route to town. This wasn't just a search, it was a coordinated operation. Her grandfather's final lesson was becoming clear. Sometimes the only way to survive was to disappear completely, to become a ghost in the very mountains that had hidden his secrets for so long. With the encrypted drive secure in her pack and Calix at her side, Elisa faced the wilderness that would either save them or claim them both. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the cabin as Marcus kicked in the front door. Elisa pressed herself against the wall of the hidden room, her heart hammering so violently she was certain he could hear it from the main room. Calix growled low beside her, hackles raised, but she placed a trembling hand on his head to keep him quiet. Heavy footsteps crossed the living room floor above. Marcus wasn't trying to be stealthy anymore. He knew she was here, her car was parked outside, and there was nowhere else she could have gone. The footsteps paused, then moved toward the kitchen. Elisa's phone showed no signal. The landline upstairs might as well have been on the moon. She looked around the hidden room desperately, searching for another way out, but the space that had once felt like a secret sanctuary now felt like a tomb. The walls seemed to press closer with each passing second. "I know you're in here, Elisa," Marcus called out, his voice carrying an artificial calm that made her skin crawl. "Your grandfather was a stubborn old fool, but I'm hoping you're smarter than he was." She heard him opening doors, checking rooms, the bedroom, the bathroom. Soon he'd be back in the living room, and it was only a matter of time before he discovered the entrance to her hiding place. Grandpa Ernie's camouflage had fooled her initially, but Marcus knew what to look for. Elisa's eyes fell on one of the documents she'd photographed earlier, a list of names with codes beside them. Her grandfather's handwriting was careful, precise. These weren't just random contacts. They were people he'd helped, witnesses he'd relocated, lives he'd saved. And now Marcus wanted to destroy all of it. The baby shifted inside her, a gentle reminder of what was at stake. She couldn't let Marcus win. Too many people had already suffered, because of his betrayal within the witness protection program. Her grandfather had died protecting these secrets, and she wouldn't let his sacrifice be in vain. Footsteps returned to the living room. Closer now. Marcus was methodically searching, and she could hear furniture being moved, objects being knocked over, then silence. "You know, your grandfather thought he was so clever," Marcus said, his voice now coming from directly above her. "Hiding evidence, playing the hero. But he never understood that some fights can't be won by old men with outdated moral codes." Elisa held her breath. Through the thin gap around the hidden door, she could see shadows moving across the floor. Marcus was examining the bookshelf, running his hands along the walls. "I tried to do this the easy way," he continued. "A simple accident. Carbon monoxide leak, maybe, quick and painless. But you had to go and complicate things, didn't you?" The casual way he spoke about murder made Elisa's blood run cold. This wasn't just about covering up his corruption anymore. Marcus had crossed a line, and there was no going back for either of them. Calix suddenly stiffened beside her, his ears pricked forward. He'd heard something she'd missed, then she heard it too, another car approaching the cabin. The engine grew louder, then cut off. A car door slammed. Marcus's footsteps stopped moving. What the hell? Elisa's heart leaped. Had Jake somehow tracked her down? Or maybe it was Sheriff Coleman, finally connecting the dots about Marcus's involvement. But her hope quickly turned to dread as she realized the truth might be far worse. Marcus might not be working alone. Heavy knocking echoed through the cabin. "Federal agents, open up." The word sent a surge of relief through Elisa, but Marcus's reaction told a different story. She heard him curse violently, then the sound of something heavy being overturned. He was destroying evidence, or looking for a weapon, or both. "Federal agents," the voice called again. "We have a warrant." Marcus's footsteps moved quickly toward the back of the cabin. He was looking for another way out, but Elisa knew there wasn't one. Grandpa Ernie had chosen this location specifically because it offered only one escape route, the front door that the agents were now guarding. The front door burst open again, this time accompanied by shouted commands and the sound of multiple people entering. Professional voices, coordinated movement. These were the real thing. "Clear the kitchen." "Bedrooms empty. Check the back rooms." Elisa remained frozen in her hiding place, afraid to reveal herself even to the agents. Too much had happened, too many people had betrayed her trust. She needed to be absolutely certain these were legitimate federal agents and not more of Marcus's allies. "We've got him," someone shouted from the back of the cabin. "Suspect in custody." The relief was overwhelming. Elisa's legs gave out and she sank to the floor of the hidden room, one hand on her belly, the other buried in Calix's fur. But even as the immediate danger passed, she knew the real reckoning was just beginning. The cabin groaned under the weight of the storm as Elisa pressed her back against the hidden room's stone wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the crack in the door, she could see shadows moving in the main room, at least 3 figures systematically searching every corner. Calix trembled beside her, his usual protective instincts muted by her whispered commands to stay quiet. Her phone had no signal, buried as they were in the mountain's embrace. The landline was in the kitchen, impossible to reach without exposing herself. She thought of Marcus, probably still driving through the storm, unaware that the danger had found them first. "Check the bedroom again," a gravelly voice commanded. The old man was paranoid. There could be false walls, hidden panels. Elisa's breath caught. They knew Grandpa Ernie's nature, understood his methods. This wasn't a random break-in. They'd been watching, waiting, planning. Her hand instinctively moved to her belly, where her daughter seemed to sense the tension, shifting restlessly. The floorboards above her head creaked as someone paced. She could hear drawers being yanked open, furniture scraping across wood. They were destroying everything, piece by piece, memory by memory. The quilt her grandmother had sewn, the chess set where she'd learned strategy at Ernie's patient hands. Nothing was sacred to these invaders. "Found something," called a younger voice, excitement cutting through the professional calm. Footsteps converged rapidly. Elisa strained to hear, pressing her ear to the cool stone. "It's a map," the voice continued, "marked with coordinates. And look, there's a safety deposit box key taped to the back." Elisa's mind raced. She'd been through every inch of the hidden room, catalogued every document, every photograph. There had been no map, no key, which meant they'd found something she'd missed, something Ernie had hidden in plain sight among his ordinary possessions. "This isn't everything," the gravelly voice said after a moment. "According to our intel, there should be more. Account numbers, contact lists. The map's just part of it. Maybe he destroyed the rest? No. He was old school, didn't trust digital records. It's here somewhere." Terror crystallized into determination as Elisa realized they wouldn't leave until they'd torn the cabin apart completely. Eventually, they'd find the hidden room. She had to act while she still had the element of surprise. Quietly, she reached for the shotgun Ernie had left mounted on the wall, checking that it was loaded. Her grandfather had taught her to shoot during teenage summers, drilling her on safety and accuracy with the same methodical patience he'd applied to everything. She'd never imagined she'd need those lessons to protect her unborn child in the very place where she'd learned them. The storm provided cover as she eased the hidden door open just wide enough to slip through. The main room was empty. They'd moved their search to the bedroom and kitchen. She could hear them arguing about whether to check the cellar or the attic first. Moving like a ghost through her childhood refuge, she made her way toward the kitchen, where she could see a figure silhouetted against the window. Her bare feet found every quiet spot on the familiar floorboards, avoiding the creaks and groans she'd memorized during countless midnight snack runs as a child. The man by the window was young, nervous energy radiating from his posture as he kept watch. In the dim light, she could see he was armed, a pistol held casually at his side. Professional, but not military. There was something sloppy about his stance that spoke of different training. "Any movement out there?" The gravelly voice called from the bedroom. "Nothing. This storm's a perfect cover for us." "Wrong," Elisa thought grimly. "It's covering me." She was 3 feet behind him when Calix, despite her earlier commands, padded out of the hidden room with a soft whine. The sound was barely audible over the wind, but the man's head turned just enough to catch movement in his peripheral vision. Training took over as he began to spin, weapon rising, mouth opening to shout a warning to his companions. But Elisa was already moving, the shotgun stock connecting with the base of his skull in a solid arc that sent him crashing into the kitchen table. The silence that followed felt deafening despite the storm's rage. She stood frozen, listening for any sign that the others had heard, but their voices continued from the back of the cabin, muffled and unconcerned. One down. She dragged the unconscious man behind the kitchen island, securing his weapon and checking his pockets for identification. Nothing useful. These people were professionals who traveled light and anonymous. The baby kicked sharply as if protesting the violence, and Elisa whispered a soft apology. But she wasn't done yet. 2 more threats remained between her family and safety, and she intended to end this tonight in the place where her grandfather had taught her that some things were worth fighting for. The sirens had long faded into the distance, carrying Marcus away in handcuffs, but Elisa could still feel the echo of his rage in her bones. She sat on the cabin's front steps, Calix pressed warm against her side, watching the last of the FBI vehicles disappear down the winding mountain road. Agent Rivera had stayed behind to wrap up the final details, her professional demeanor softened by something that looked almost like maternal concern. "The documents you found will help us unravel a network that's been operating for over 2 decades, Rivera said, settling beside Elisa on the weathered wood. "Your grandfather saved a lot of lives with what he did." Elisa's hand moved instinctively to her belly, where the baby stirred as if responding to her touch. "I keep thinking about all those family dinners, all those stories he told about his travels. How much of it was real? More than you might think." Rivera's voice carried an unexpected gentleness. The places were real, the people he met were real. Ernest just had a different reason for being there than anyone knew. He was trying to stop bad people from doing terrible things. The late afternoon sun slanted through the pine trees, casting long shadows across the clearing where just hours ago Marcus had held a gun to her head. The memory made her shiver despite the warmth. Everything had happened so fast. Marcus grabbing her when the FBI closed in, his desperate threats, the way Calix had suddenly lunged from the undergrowth like some avenging spirit. The German shepherd had latched onto Marcus's gun arm with the precision of a trained protection dog, giving Rivera the opening she needed. "He knew, didn't he?" Elisa asked, scratching behind Calix's ears. "Grandpa Ernie trained him for this." Rivera nodded. Ernest was always thinking 3 moves ahead. He knew that someday someone might come looking, and he wanted to make sure you'd be protected. She paused, studying Elisa's profile. "The question now is what you want to do with the cabin." Elisa had been dreading this moment, this decision that would shape not just her future, but her child's. The cabin held so many secrets, had been the stage for so much deception and danger. But as she looked out at the mountains rising like ancient guardians around the clearing, she felt something else stirring beneath the fear and confusion. Peace. For all its hidden compartments and buried secrets, this place still carried the essence of the man who had taught her to fish in the creek, who had shown her which berries were safe to eat, who had made her feel like the most important person in the world during those childhood summers. "I think I'll keep it," she said quietly. "Clean it out, make it safe, turn it into what it was supposed to be. A place where family comes first." Rivera smiled, the expression transforming her stern features. "I think Ernest would like that." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the shadows lengthen. Calix dozed against Elisa's leg, his massive head heavy on her thigh. She could feel his steady breathing, the absolute trust in his relaxed posture. This dog who had been a stranger just days ago now felt like family. Another gift from a grandfather who had loved her enough to plan for dangers she couldn't even imagine. "There's one more thing," Rivera said eventually, reaching into her jacket. She pulled out a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. "We found this in the hidden room, separate from all the other documents. It has your name on it." Elisa's hands trembled as she took the envelope. Her name was written across the front in Grandpa Ernie's familiar scrawl, along with a single instruction: "When it's over." Inside she found a single sheet of paper covered in his handwriting. "My dearest Elisa," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then you know the truth about my life, and you've survived the danger I prayed would never find you. I'm sorry for the deception, sorry for the fear you must have felt, sorry that my choices cast shadows into your bright world. But I'm not sorry for the work I did, because every criminal stopped, every victim saved. Every small victory against darkness was done in the name of family, in the name of you and all the people I loved who deserve to live in a safer world. You have a choice now about who you want to be, what kind of life you want to build. Choose love, choose hope, choose the light that was always the best part of you. And know that whatever you decide, wherever you go, I am proud beyond words to have been your grandfather. P.S. Take good care of Calix. He's got excellent judgment about people." Elisa wiped away tears she hadn't realized were falling. The baby kicked, a gentle reminder of the future growing inside her, of all the stories yet to be written. Around her, the mountain cabin settled into evening quiet, finally ready to become what it had always been meant to be, a home.